The first man who vanished was Henry Wexler, a harmless trapper whose biggest sin was drinking too much on Sundays. Folks said he was last seen heading toward the old bramble barn, a sagging patchwork of rotted lumber tucked deep inside the Arkansas hills. Everyone knew the three women who lived there, if you could even call them women in the ordinary sense. They were enormous, towering things, each brushing 7 feet tall, with shoulders like oxen and faces that looked carved from river stone. No one knew their real names. People whispered them as the Bramble Sisters, and even saying that much after sunset made a man feel watched. When Henry didn't return, no one panicked. But then the second man vanished. And then the third. Within 2 months, 19 men were gone, swallowed by those woods as if the earth had yawned open and taken them whole. The townsfolk tried to explain it away: accidents, wolves, men running off, but every road of reason led back to the same rotted barn, leaning crooked under the weight of secrets older than the town itself. Some swore they saw a lantern swinging there at night, moving as if carried by hands too large for any normal person. Others claimed they heard voices drifting through the trees, deep, layered murmurs, as if something inside the barn was speaking in 2 tones at once. There was a wrongness in those woods, a thick, breathing darkness that seemed to pulse with every missing man. No one wanted to go near it. No one wanted to believe the stories. But fear has a way of gathering, sticking to people like burrs, and soon even the bravest men walked a little faster past the tree-line, avoiding the shadows where the sisters were said to stand. The barn had been quiet for weeks, but the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like something waiting. Something hungry. And on one cold night in November 1897, when the moon hung low and yellow over the hills, 5 men marched into the woods with rifles and lanterns, determined to end the rumors once and for all. They were strong, seasoned hunters. But as they disappeared into the black timber path, the townsfolk who watched them go swore they heard the faintest sound coming from the direction of the barn, a soft, breathy whisper, rising like wind through a hollow place, calling them deeper. None of those 5 men ever came back. And the voices coming from the barn only grew louder. Rumors in the Ozarks had a way of growing legs, especially in the late 1800s when news traveled slower than fear. Key point number 1 begins with those murmurings, quiet at first, whispered at trading posts and creekside washing spots, then louder as more people claimed to have seen the same impossible things. The talk centered around 3 enormous women who kept to themselves in a decrepit barn deep within the Arkansas woods. Folks called them sisters, though no one could say who their parents were or where they came from. Some swore they'd simply appeared one fog-heavy autumn, their silhouettes rising like giants from the tree-line as if the forest had birthed them. What made them unforgettable was their size. These weren't tall women, these were towering figures, almost 7 feet each, with limbs that looked too long, and shoulders that strained the seams of whatever old fabric they draped themselves in. Travelers who passed near their land claimed the barn groaned under their weight when they moved around inside, as though it were a living thing complaining about its occupants. Yet for all their size, the sisters were eerily quiet. They didn't speak to strangers unless they had to, and even then, their voices came out in odd layers, like multiple tones blending into one. Some men described the encounter as unsettling, as if they were hearing echoes from inside a hollow chest. Others said the sisters watched them with eyes too pale, too unblinking, like frost had settled in their gaze. Soon people began telling stories that the sisters lured men to help with chores, fixing the barn roof, clearing brush, repairing fences. A few men returned from these trips claiming nothing unusual happened at all, only that the sisters seemed strangely eager, almost desperate, to keep their place in good condition. But others went and never came back, and their disappearances fed the rumors like dry wood thrown into a fire. The woods surrounding the barn took on a cursed reputation. Hunters avoided it, claiming they saw enormous shapes moving between the trees at dusk. Children dared each other to get close enough to hear the low humming that sometimes drifted from the barn, a sound like chanting under one's breath. The sisters became something between legend and warning, the kind of story grown men repeated with a forced laugh while glancing behind their shoulders. No one wanted to admit they were afraid, yet everyone felt the same chill when the conversation turned to those 3 towering figures and the decaying barn they called home, a place where shadows stretched too long and the silence seemed to breathe with a pulse of its own. The disappearances began quietly, almost politely, as though the woods were swallowing men one at a time so no one would notice. At first, people chalked it up to the usual dangers, accidents on the trails, wild animals, a man deciding to leave his debts behind and start fresh somewhere else. But the pattern became impossible to ignore when every missing man was last seen walking in the direction of the same place, the collapsing barn where the towering sisters lived. The women had gained a strange kind of reputation for inviting local men to help with chores, lifting heavy beams, moving feed sacks, repairing the sagging roof. Some men claimed the sisters offered a warm meal in return, usually at dusk when the woods were already dark and full of unsettling sounds. It seemed harmless enough at first. A few men had proudly bragged about being invited, wearing it like a badge earned from facing something out of the ordinary. But when these same men failed to return home, their families grew uneasy. One wife recounted how her husband went to fix a broken hinge on the barn door. She waited all night, lantern burning, only to find his horse wandering outside their yard the next morning, saddle still cinched tight. More men followed the same path, heading toward the sisters' land with tools in hand, disappearing as though the forest itself was closing behind them. Soon, the invitations became something whispered about in dread. Men who received them felt obligated to go, either out of pride or the unspoken pressure of being watched by the community. But behind that pressure lurked a deeper truth: no one wanted to refuse the sisters. There was something unsettling about the way they asked, the way their pale eyes lingered too long, the way their voices seemed to dip into a harmony that didn't belong to humans. As the number climbed, 5, 9, then 13 missing, the town began connecting the dots. Some recalled seeing strange lantern light flickering in the barn long after midnight. Others mentioned finding the deep, wide footprints of the sisters leading toward the creek but never returning. Dogs refused to approach the property, backing away with their hackles raised and tails tucked. Every day, the fear grew thicker. The men still living started avoiding the forest entirely. Entire families moved closer to neighbors, unwilling to sleep without hearing other human voices nearby. People whispered that something was happening inside that barn, something that feasted on the silence after a man's footsteps vanished into the woods. And still, as though following some grim pattern, the sisters continued to invite men to visit, each one stepping into a darkness from which no one had ever returned. The morning Sheriff Amos Cray found the blood-stained boot on his porch. The entire tone of the Ozark disappearances changed. Until then, the missing men had been a mystery wrapped in rumor, disturbing, yes, but still something people could pretend was explainable. But that single boot, caked with dried mud and a dark crust of blood around the torn leather, stripped away every comforting excuse the sheriff had been clinging to. The boot belonged to Matthew Pike, a man known for his sturdy build and stubborn attitude, someone not easily scared or overpowered. His wife had reported him missing a week earlier, insisting he'd gone to help the three towering sisters repair a broken wagon wheel. No one wanted to believe she was right, but now the truth sat on the sheriff's porch like an accusation. What rattled the sheriff even more was the fact that the boot hadn't simply been tossed there. It was placed neatly, almost gently, as if the person, or thing, that delivered it wanted him to notice every detail. There were deep scratches across the side, not from rocks or briars, but from something that left parallel grooves like desperate claw marks. The blood had soaked through the stitching, suggesting Matthew had still been alive when whatever happened to him tore the boot from his foot. Amos silently stood over it for several minutes, listening to the early morning wind whistle across his porch boards, trying to ignore the creeping sense that someone was watching him from the woods behind his home. No tracks led up to the boot. That was the strangest part. The dirt around the porch had been recently rained on, soft enough to capture even the smallest footprint. But there was nothing, no marks from boots, no drag lines, nothing a human could have left without detection. The sheriff picked the boot up, feeling a coldness rising from the leather that made his skin prickle. He didn't want to admit how much it unsettled him, but the truth gnawed at him. Someone wanted him to see this, wanted him to know the disappearances weren't accidents. Word spread fast. By noon the town gathered in clumps outside the sheriff's office, whispering about who could have delivered the boot and why they chose to leave it with Amos and not anyone else. Some said it was a warning. Others said it was a challenge. A few believed the sisters themselves brought it in the dead of night, moving silently through the trees like shadows with enormous bodies, leaving no trace. The sheriff knew one thing for certain: whatever left that boot wanted him involved. And for the first time, he feared the investigation wasn't about finding missing men anymore but about being invited into something far darker, something that had already begun pulling him into its center. The traveling preacher arrived in town just as the fear around the missing men was starting to boil over. He wasn't a man easily shaken. He'd spent his life wandering through rough territory, praying over the wounded, settling disputes, and sleeping in places most folks would have been too scared to approach. But when he stepped into the tavern that evening, dust still clinging to his coat, his face carried a tightness none of the locals missed. He sat down, ordered water, and after a long silence finally admitted the strange thing he'd witnessed near the sisters' property. He told them he had been passing through the woods at dusk, guided only by the fading light and the sound of his own boots crunching over leaves, when he heard something that didn't fit the forest. At first, it sounded like a woman calling from far off, the voice low and soft, as if carried by wind through a hollow place. But the longer he listened, the more he realized the voice wasn't alone. There were layers to it, tones rising and falling together, forming a kind of whispering harmony that made the hair along his arms lift. He said it didn't sound human, not exactly. It was too deep at the base, too airy at the top, like several throats speaking the same words but not quite in unison. When he asked if anyone lived nearby, a few men exchanged glances, and someone muttered the name that everyone avoided saying, the sisters. The preacher nodded slowly, saying the voices came from the direction of their barn. He hadn't planned to walk near their land, but the sound had drawn him forward against his better judgment. He found himself stopping just short of their clearing, staring at the barn's crooked frame, a faint light flickering inside as though a lantern swayed in unsteady hands. The voices grew louder the closer he stood, slipping between the cracks of the wooden planks, echoing like something trapped inside was calling out, or calling in. He felt a pressure in his chest, a heaviness that made breathing difficult, as if the woods themselves were urging him to turn back. And so he did. He walked away quickly, refusing to look over his shoulder even when he felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes following him through the trees. As the preacher recounted this, his fingers trembled around his cup. He insisted he wasn't a man prone to superstition, yet he felt certain the barn held something unnatural. His words tightened the air in the tavern, settling like dust into the already heavy fear. For many, it confirmed what they had tried not to believe, that whatever was happening in the woods wasn't just the work of three enormous reclusive women but something darker speaking through them, whispering from the shadows in voices that were never meant to be heard by human ears. The disappearance of single men had rattled the town, but what shattered its remaining sense of safety was the vanishing of an entire search party. These weren't wanderers or drunkards or men known for taking foolish risks. They were seasoned hunters and trappers, the kind who knew the Ozark woods better than their own front porches. When 5 of them volunteered to investigate the sisters' property, most believed that if anyone could return with answers, it would be those men. They left just before dawn, lanterns swinging, rifles strapped across their backs, determined to follow the trail of the missing and finally confront whatever darkness had been festering inside those woods. Their families watched them go, trying to ignore the sick feeling that clung to the chilly morning air. By noon, their horses came galloping back without riders. The animals were foaming at the mouth, sides heaving, eyes rolling wild with terror. One horse collapsed right in the middle of the street, trembling as though it had outrun something monstrous. There were deep scratches across another's flank, long parallel marks too wide for a wolf and too clean to be made by any broken branch. People gathered around the horses, whispering, calling for the sheriff, praying under their breath, but there was no sign of the 5 men who'd left so confidently only hours before. A few brave folks followed the horses' tracks back toward the woods but stopped the moment the path veered near the sisters' land. The forest felt wrong, heavier, as if something unseen was watching from behind the trees. Even the birds were silent. The sheriff attempted to organize a second search, but not a single soul stepped forward. No one was willing to follow the same route the horses had fled from. And late that afternoon, when the wind shifted, several townspeople swore they heard something drifting through the trees, a faint, tangled hum, rising and falling like distant chanting. Some claimed it sounded like voices overlapping, echoing in a pattern too strange to be natural. Others said it sounded more like a warning. As night fell, lanterns were lit in every home, windows shuttered, families huddled together as though preparing for a storm. But no storm came. Just darkness. A thick, breathless darkness that settled over the town like a blanket of dread. The people knew in their bones that the 5 missing men weren't lost, weren't wandering, weren't coming back with answers. Something had taken them. Something that terrified even their horses into running for their lives. And worst of all, everyone knew exactly where that something lived, inside the rotting barn in the heart of the woods, where the sisters waited in silence for whoever would be foolish enough to come next. The fear surrounding the sisters' barn grew almost unbearable when a young woman from a nearby farm claimed she had seen something no one wanted to admit might be real. She was barely 17, a quiet girl named Lila, known for keeping to herself and helping her mother tend the garden and livestock. One evening, just as the sun sank behind the hills and the sky darkened to bruised purple, Lila had been returning from gathering eggs when she noticed a faint, flickering light in the distance. At first, she assumed it was another lantern someone had left by the trail, but as she drew closer, she realized the glow wasn't on the path at all. It came from the sisters' barn. What made her story chilling was not the light itself, but the movement she saw within. Shadows shifted inside, too large, too fluid to belong to any human. The silhouettes moved with an unnatural rhythm, bending and stretching as if the space inside the barn was distorting around them. Lila froze, pressing herself behind a tree, heart hammering in her chest. She watched as the figures, three immense shapes, seemed to glide across the floor, stopping and starting in sync with a sound she couldn't quite place. It wasn't a voice, exactly, but a low, undulating hum that rose and fell in a cadence that made her stomach twist. She whispered a prayer, but it felt useless, swallowed by the stillness around her. Finally, a shadow moved toward the open doorway. Lantern light reflected off something glimmering, perhaps metal or glass, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw a man's shape being lifted or carried across the floor, though it didn't make sense. He had been among the missing, she realized, and now she feared she had glimpsed what had happened to him. Trembling, Lila ran back to her home, not daring to look behind her, yet she could feel the weight of eyes in the dark, following her through the underbrush. When she told her parents, they clutched her in disbelief and fear. The story spread quickly, adding a new layer to the already thick dread hanging over the community. People began to speak in whispers of seeing lights flicker in the barn at night, of hearing strange noises drifting through the trees. Hunters refused to go near the area, children dared each other only to peek from a distance, and grown men spoke of the shapes as if they were living shadows. Lila's sighting made the danger feel immediate. It was no longer an abstract fear tied to missing men, it was real, tangible, and visible, proving that the barn was alive with something unnatural. The townsfolk felt the pull of it, the dark gravity of a place that consumed without leaving a trace, and slowly, one by one, everyone began to understand that the sisters' home in the woods was far more than a simple dwelling. It was a trap, a lure, and a chamber where the forest's secrets could take shape and hide from the light of day. The discovery of the massive footprints near the sisters' barn marked a turning point in the town's understanding of the horrors lurking in the Ozark woods. A hunter named Elias Monroe had been out tracking deer when he stumbled upon them, his boots crunching over the damp leaves as he followed what he initially thought was a large bear. But when he bent closer to inspect the tracks, he realized these were no ordinary animal prints. Each imprint was impossibly large, at least 15 inches long and nearly 7 inches wide, with deep grooves that suggested weight far beyond what any normal human could bear. The claws, or what appeared to be claw-like impressions, scratched the soil in sharp, deliberate lines, forming a chaotic circle around the barn, as though the creatures inside had been pacing back and forth. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He knew every trail in those woods, he had walked them since he was a boy, and he had never seen anything like this. The prints weren't scattered randomly. They moved in a pattern that defied sense, sometimes leading toward the creek, sometimes veering back to the barn, as if the beings had been toying with someone or something inside. He called the sheriff immediately, and a small group of townsfolk followed him back to the site that afternoon, lanterns casting trembling shadows on the trees. The size of the prints alone left them speechless, but what unnerved them most was the precision of the path. Whoever, or whatever, had made them had moved deliberately, circling the barn in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, pausing and then repeating, as though performing some ritual they could not comprehend. Some of the men tried to measure the depth of the grooves, pressing sticks into the soil, only to find that the ground seemed unnaturally firm, as if it had absorbed the weight and then resisted their attempts to inspect it further. By sunset, whispers filled the air, each person trying to convince themselves the others were exaggerating. But the truth was impossible to ignore. These footprints were a tangible clue that something enormous, inhuman, and terrifyingly intelligent inhabited the barn. That night, the wind carried a soft rustling from the woods, and the townsfolk swore they heard the rhythmic thump of heavy feet echoing from the direction of the clearing. The following morning, hunters who dared approach the barn again reported the prints had shifted, almost as if the entities had been watching them, leaving signs meant to unnerve anyone who tried to follow. From that day forward, the barn was no longer just the home of three reclusive sisters. It was a place of power and menace, a center of something alive and calculating, and every man, woman, and child who glimpsed the prints knew the forest itself had become a trap, with secrets too monstrous to speak aloud and footsteps too large to ever be safely ignored. The sheriff's discovery of the torn coat at the barn door was the first direct sign that whatever was happening inside the sisters' property was not only real but deliberately reaching out to terrorize the town. Amos Cray had been walking the perimeter of the barn at dusk, lantern in hand, trying to summon the courage to venture inside. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and rotting wood, and the trees around the clearing whispered with a chill that seemed to crawl along his neck. That's when his eyes fell on the sleeve of a man's coat, snagged on a splintered plank of the barn's massive door. The fabric was torn cleanly in several places, as if something had ripped it in a violent struggle. Amos recognized it instantly, the missing man's coat, belonging to Jacob Holloway, a logger who had disappeared nearly 2 weeks prior. His stomach tightened as he crouched to examine it. The edges were frayed, the buttons gone, and a dark smear across the sleeve suggested blood. It was fresh enough to make him shiver, but old enough to hint at days of exposure to the elements. For a moment, he thought he could hear faint movement inside the barn, a shifting of weight on rotted boards that creaked in time with his own heartbeat. Summoning his courage, he reached toward the door, lantern trembling in his hand, and just as he stepped closer, a sound reached him, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably a voice. It was low, layered, and resonant, the words indistinct but carrying a weight that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him, echoing off the crooked beams of the barn. "Leave," it whispered, a single word that rolled through the trees like the rustling of dead leaves. Amos froze, gripping the lantern so tightly his knuckles turned white. The rational part of his mind told him it could be the wind, or the distant call of an animal, but every instinct screamed that this was something else, something deliberate. He looked around, scanning the clearing, but the shadows were dense, shifting unnaturally, hiding shapes too large to be human. Even the trees seemed to lean closer, bending as though to hear what he would do next. The sheriff took a single cautious step back, and the whisper repeated, softer now but still commanding, pressing into his mind, "Leave." That coat, caught on the barn, was more than evidence. It was a message. Someone, or something, was aware of his presence, aware of every attempt to intrude. And the barn, already a place of fear and speculation, became a living entity in Amos's eyes, one that demanded respect, submission, and obedience, ready to punish anyone who ignored its warning. In that moment, standing under the creeping shadow of the enormous structure, the sheriff realized the barn and its occupants were not just hiding secrets, they were controlling them, shaping them, and luring any who dared too close into a darkness from which no one had yet returned. The first time anyone saw the sisters standing at the tree lean, the sight was enough to stop a man's heart. Their silhouettes were enormous, unnatural even for women of great height, each figure stretching nearly 7 feet from head to toe. Witnesses said the sisters moved with a stillness that defied explanation, as though the air itself bent around them, holding them in place. They didn't approach, didn't wave, didn't speak, they simply watched, their immense forms framed by the darkening sky and the thick shadows of the forest behind them. At first, townsfolk thought their eyes were reflecting lantern light, but those who dared get closer realized the glow wasn't a reflection, it was something alive within their gaze. Pale and piercing, it seemed to measure, to weigh the intruders' souls, to assess their courage or foolishness. The sighting happened one late afternoon when a group of men had gathered at the edge of the woods, discussing the latest disappearance. They had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that seeing the sisters would give them answers, maybe even a chance to communicate. But the effect was the opposite. Every man who glimpsed the towering figures reported a sensation unlike fear they had felt before. It wasn't the jump of surprise or the tightening of the chest that comes from danger. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of being scrutinized by something beyond comprehension, a consciousness that seemed to extend through the treetops and the soil, reaching into their very minds. Some claimed that the sisters' heads tilted in perfect unison, a synchronized motion that no human could manage, like a signal passed silently between them. Others swore they heard a faint humming, a vibration low and resonant that filled the forest, rising from the sisters' presence rather than from their voices. The men tried to speak, to call out, but their words stuck in their throats. The sisters did not move, did not beckon, and yet the very energy of their presence seemed to pull the men forward, toward the barn, toward a fate no one had returned to describe. Shadows lengthened and deepened as the sun dipped below the horizon, and still the sisters remained at the edge of the clearing, unmoving yet undeniably alive. For those who watched, the encounter left a permanent mark. Even after retreating to the relative safety of town, they felt the lingering weight of those enormous figures, the oppressive sense that they had been studied, catalogued, and noted by eyes that missed nothing. It was the first direct proof that the sisters were not merely reclusive giants hiding in a barn, but sentinels of something far darker. The forest itself had become their stage, and any who dared enter it, any who approached the barn, were actors caught in a performance orchestrated by three beings whose immense presence alone could bend reality and command obedience through sheer, silent power. The final group that dared to enter the sisters' barn believed themselves prepared for anything the forest could throw at them, yet nothing in their experience had readied them for what awaited inside. Lanterns bobbed in trembling hands as they pushed through the warped doorway, the hinges groaning like a living thing protesting their intrusion. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of old timber, damp earth, and something darker, something that made the skin crawl and the stomach churn. Shadows pooled in corners, clinging to the beams and floorboards, shifting with a life of their own. At first, the men tried to call out, hoping to hear human voices in return, to confront the towering sisters and finally end the mystery that had haunted the town for months. But the barn responded with silence, a dense, suffocating silence that pressed on their ears and chests alike, broken only by faint creaks and the whisper of some unseen presence moving just beyond the lantern light. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, layered voices that rose and fell in strange harmonies, echoing from every corner at once. The men exchanged uneasy glances, each recognizing the same dread in the other's eyes, yet no one spoke the truth aloud. This was unlike anything human, something that had been waiting, watching, and learning from the moments when men had disappeared before. As they advanced deeper into the barn, the shadows shifted again, forming shapes that resembled the sisters but stretched impossibly long, bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. The floor groaned beneath them, yet the sounds were not their own footsteps, they were heavier, deliberate, as though something enormous paced above or beneath them simultaneously. One of the men, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, tried to step forward to confront a looming shape, but a sudden rush of cold air slammed into him, forcing him to stumble back as if repelled by an invisible hand. Lanterns flickered and swung wildly, casting jagged patterns across the walls that made it impossible to discern solid from shadow. Every heartbeat echoed in the space, mingling with whispers, murmurs, and the faintest hint of movement above, below, and behind. Panic set in, but there was no clear exit. The doorway they had entered through seemed farther away, distorted by the oppressive darkness. And then, from the far end of the barn, a single deep, resonant tone rose, followed by multiple overlapping whispers, forming words they could not understand, yet the meaning was clear. They had been seen, catalogued, and condemned. One by one, the men faltered, hesitation turning to terror, as the realization dawned that this place was alive, predatory, and that the barn and its colossal inhabitants had claimed yet another set of intruders. The space seemed to pulse with a consciousness of its own, and the shadows thickened, swallowing every flicker of lantern light, until the men, along with every flicker of hope, vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the echoes of voices in the barn that no one in Arkansas would ever forget.